Well, good afternoon and welcome to this event. The subject today, as you know, is issues around Ukraine and its application for membership of the European Union. My name is Dennis Galligan, Professor of Socio-Legal Studies Emeritus at Oxford University and Director of the Centre of the Oxford Global Society. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. I'd like to introduce my co-moderator today, Katerina Sipulova, who will say a few words about herself. Katerina?
Thank you very much, Dennis. Hello and welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you all here attending this webinar on a particularly important topic. As Dennis said, I'm a co-moderator of the event. I work as the head of the Judicial Studies Institute at Masaryk University, which is a research unit based in Brno, researching mostly courts, judges, judicial independence, and now focusing in particular on informal institutions.
Thank you, Katerina. I'd just like to say a word about the Oxford Global Society before we proceed with the substance. The Oxford Global Society is Oxford-based. It's an independent institute, recently created as a think tank. So we research-based but policy-oriented, I think would be a good way of summarizing. And our interest is in themes of international importance, of which, of course, there are many. Amongst our various subjects are governance and law, global politics, the digital age, and political economy. And I'd just like to say, if any of our audience out there feel that you would like to be involved with the Oxford Global Society, that you could in some way contribute to the work of the Oxford Global Society, please get in touch. We welcome a broad base for our fellows, our associate fellows, our interns, and so on. All right, on that note, let me just say, now we will proceed very closely according to time. We must finish at 4:30. Timothy Garton Ash will leave at 4:15, just to let you know in advance. But we hope in the next hour and a half to have a very penetrating and wide-ranging discussion of the issues before us. So now I'm going to invite Katerina to introduce the context and set out some of the issues we will be discussing today. Katerina.
Thank you very much, Dennis. So, as we already mentioned several times, this is an incredibly important topic, not only for Ukraine, but for the future of European Union and Europe as a region. At the very beginning of the Russian invasion to Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky officially submitted an application on behalf of Ukraine to join the European Union. And as we are speaking today, the European Commission is preparing an opinion in an expedited procedure, which could potentially open the door for next stages of the accession process. But in fact, the European future was the driving force behind internal political processes in Ukraine for a very long time, for decades at this point, creating one of the most explosive cleavages between the pro-Russian and pro-Western political forces. Since the start of the war, the political spectrum of Ukraine, as well as the citizens, stand united in their effort to clearly demonstrate to the world that they have place not only in Europe, but also inside of the European Union. It is truly a historical moment. It is the first time that a country which is in ongoing conflict is applying for the membership in the European Union. And the war in Ukraine also triggered significant changes inside of the European Union. We have seen initial rapid agreement on sanctions, unprecedented solidarity with migrants, also in the countries which were typically very reluctant to admit any refugees. Some of the internal discussions, particularly the rule of law crisis inside of the member countries, have been put aside for the time being. Yet with the coming weeks and months, we also have seen new discussions emerging and opening among member states and among European Union institutions. So there are a couple of questions that should be addressed. How ready Ukraine is to join the European Union? What benchmark should and would European institutions use to evaluate the Ukraine and its preparedness? Is the European Union even able to swiftly integrate a new country, both legally and politically? And what would such an integration mean for the narrative of the European integration process, and for the multidimensional crisis that is happening inside of the European Union, particularly the rule of law crisis we all heard so much about. And finally, there are some geopolitical questions, what the integration would mean for the security in the region and for the reconstruction of Ukraine as a country. In the today's sessions, we are going to address each of these questions in two consequential sessions. The first one will start with more legal aspects of the accession and the lessons we learned from the former Eastern enlargement. And then we will go through the political questions, the changing narrative of the European integration, as well as the conflict and the repercussions for the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. So if I may, I would now take the opportunity to introduce the speakers and the panelists to today. We have an amazing composition of speakers, truly interdisciplinary session that is happening today. First of all, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Roman Petrov. He's the head of Jean Monnet Center of Excellence and Jean Monnet Chair of EU Law at National University in Kiev. He specializes in EU law, harmonization, approximation of the EU law, as well as regional integration in the post-Soviet area. Next speaker will be Catherine Barnard, Professor of European and Employment Law at Trinity College, University of Cambridge. She is a Deputy Director of UK in Changing Europe, the research platform, excellent expert on the EU law, and she authored several amazing monographies and books on the EU law. I also have to point out that she unfortunately will also have to leave us at 3:30, but she will manage to speak in the first session of today's webinar. Next, we have Milada Vachudova, Professor of Political Science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She specializes in European politics and political change in post-communist Europe, including the impact of EU on internal actors and domestic politics. She worked extensively on ethnopopulism and democratic crisis in European Union. The next speaker is Timothy Garton Ash, Professor of European Studies and SIAC Berlin Professorial Fellow at St. Antony's College, University of Oxford. He is a Senior Fellow at Hoover Institution, Stanford University. He also directs the Darendorf Program for the Study of Freedom at St. Antony's College. He authored many excellent publications on the history of presence, the contemporary history of Europe, and he's an expert in the revolutions in the post-communist area. Maria Popova, our next speaker, is Jean Monnet Chair and Associate Professor of Political Science at McGill in Montreal. She's also a scientific co-director of the Jean Monnet Center in Montreal. Her research focuses on the rule of law, judicial reform, political corruption, populist parties, and legal repressions of dissent across post-communist region. Nowadays, she works extensively on the democratization of Ukraine and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. And finally, it's my pleasure to welcome also Daniel Bilak, Senior Counsel at Kinstellar and Oxford Global Society Fellow. He's a former Chief Investment Advisor to the Ukraine Prime Minister. He has extensive experience with institutional reforms, extending to rule of law, judicial reforms, administrative reforms, and anti-corruption measures. And currently, he is also part of Kyiv's territorial defense forces. So as I have said, truly interdisciplinary composition of speakers, and I'm just looking forward to starting the session.
Thank you very much, Katerina. So we move immediately to the first session, and I would like to call on Roman to begin.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be with you. Thank you for inviting. And the time limit, as I know, is quite restricted, so I'll try to encapsulate general ideas about the background of the Ukrainian dreams for the accession in 5 minutes. Right. So my proposition number one is that the Ukrainian dream for the accession is inextricably linked to the whole idea of the Ukraine's independence. Since Ukraine's independence in 1991, I may argue almost all presidents and governments in Ukraine have been supporting the idea of Ukraine's gradual accession and integration with the European Union. And it also brings us to the second point. I would argue that the desire and objective to join the European Union is also could be considered as part of the Ukrainian identity, which is quite complicated. which is put together from different countries, different cultures, but nevertheless represents today's Ukraine. And therefore, the membership in the European Union is seen by the majority of population and those who support this course as a logical continuation and strengthening of the Ukrainian identity. Point number 3 is the European Union, regardless is its weak standing in field of security and defense, still considered as a sort of NATO #2 security provider and possible pillar to strengthen Ukrainians' territorial integrity and security. So it's also quite a very important factor which always has been considered by the Ukrainian ruling elites. And point number 4, Ukraine actually has been consistently searching for a best suitable model and most efficient model of its integration. The first opportunity which skipped out from Ukrainian hands, it's a big bang in enlargement in early 2000. The mere fact that some former Soviet republics managed to embark in time onto the EU integration train a bit hurt the Ukrainian establishment, and they started considering the path of concluding Europe-like or like Europe association agreement as a possible path towards the full EU membership. And therefore the idea of concluding the association agreement became very prominent and important. As a result, when the idea and negotiations on the association agreement were concluded in the year 2012, surprised decline by former President Yanukovych to sign the agreement at the Eastern Partnership Summit in Vilnius in the end of 2013 caused and actually invigorated popular mass protests in Kyiv and nationwide, which resulted into the known Revolution of Dignity or Euromaidan. And therefore it explains, at least partly, that Ukraine has invested into the idea of the EU membership via different paths, through the association agreement or through the shadow membership, or better through a direct accession process. Not only its time, but also closely linked this desire to its identity, to its idea of independence, and also to its idea of survival as it stands today. And therefore, the event which took place on February 28th was quite surprised. But nevertheless, it was a very bold step taken in a situation when President Zelensky faced just 15 kilometers away from his residence Russian troops. Nevertheless, this bold step must be appreciated. And finally, as many experts in EU law debated, the right moment for the application took place. And but it also opens the Pandora box and triggered so many challenges, as well as for internal Ukrainian development and for the external European unity and sustainability of its legal system. I hope that I'm in time, and I look forward to answering further questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Roman. You're an exemplar at time-wise. You're a model to be followed. Thank you for being so concise and so perceptive. We look forward to coming back to some of your points in a few minutes. But we'll keep going. And Catherine, I'd like you to take the floor. Catherine.
Thank you. Can you see the screen? Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
No. Oh,
yes.
yes. Yes, Article 49, we can see.
That's the excitement never stops. That's thank you very much indeed for the kind invitation, and thank you very much, Roma, for a passionate introduction. I'm going to be very boring, and in the 5 minutes I've got, I'm going to talk black letter law, and that is the accession process and what actually is required under EU law. And the main article that is central to this is Article 49. And there are a couple of provisions which I want to draw attention to in the course of what I'm going to say. As you can see, it says any European state which respects the values referred to in Article 2, which are things like human dignity, freedom, equality, and is committed to promoting them may apply to be a member of the European Union. And then the next is about the procedure which applies, but the key point is it's a unanimous agreement of the Council, which is required before any state can join. And then once there is a decision that a state might be able to join, the crucial thing is in the third paragraph there, you can see that any agreement is submitted for ratification by all contracting states, so that's all the member states of the EU, in accordance with their respective constitutional requirements, which may or may not require having a referendum in those states. So Article 49 is really rather important, but what Article 49 doesn't say very much about is what are the criteria for accession, which brings us to the Copenhagen Criteria introduced in 1993, which gave a broad framework to indicate whether a state was ready to join, and these are now rather well known. So political criteria, stability of institutions, crucially, the rule of law, economic criteria, functioning market economy, and thirdly, administrative and institutional capacity to absorb the whole body of the European acquis, the jargon for all of EU law and policies. So it's a fairly demanding set of criteria. Now, what you'll also note underneath is I've taken a couple of sentences from the Commission's website, and the European Commission also adds that account is taken of the Union's capacity to absorb new members while maintain the momentum of European integration. You might note that that language of absorption and capacity to absorb is not found in Article 49. So it's a controversial addition that the EU applies. And then it goes on to say the EU reserves the right to decide when a candidate country has met those criteria. So what's the process? Essentially, it's a 4-stage process. Stage 1 is application. And the state can apply if the state, like Ukraine, thinks it meets the accession criteria. It thinks it's a European state which satisfies those Article 2 values. And then the Commission writes an avis, and that's French for opinion, and to decide whether the candidate can be given whether the country can be given a candidate country status. Now, candidate status is significant, it's part of the process, but it does not mean that the country will necessarily join the EU automatically, as I'll show in a moment. But once it's got candidate status, then you move on to the negotiation stage. So both sides have a negotiating mandate, and then that is approved by the General Affairs Council, the Council by unanimity, to open accession negotiations. And those accession negotiations are focused on 35 chapters. And just to give you an overview of what it looks like, those are the chapters that need to be negotiated. Those chapters were somewhat rethought in 2020, and by far the most important ones for the EU are what's described as the fundamentals here, and that's the first chapter which is opened, and it's the last chapter to be closed, and it touches on very sensitive things like judiciary and fundamental rights and financial control. So this is really very important, but the negotiations are done by chapters and by clustering of chapters, and the clusters you can see there. Now, once all the chapters have been closed, including on the fundamentals, then the Commission can recommend membership, and that is approved by a majority of the European Parliament, crucially, unanimously in the Council, and then it's also got to be approved by the constitutional traditions of the member states. So four-stage process. Now, that four-stage process looks beautifully smooth and straightforward. Of course, in reality, it takes time. And what you'll see on this slide is the approximate length of time that negotiations take. I think the striking thing is that although the average is about 5 years, in reality, for some of the more recent states, which have taken longer to align, you're looking at Croatia, it's taken the best part of 8 years. So normally, and I stress normally because we are not in a normal world, normally these things take quite some time, and it requires patience on the side of the candidate country. My final point is this. These are the most recent countries that have applied for membership. I haven't included Ukraine here because obviously it's the situation that we're looking at the moment, but I just thought it might be helpful for you just to get an overview of the, the amount of time it's all taking. And as you can see, I mean, if you look at Turkey, it requested to join in '87, and we're still a very long way from getting there. Likewise, Serbia requested in 2009. Accession negotiations have opened, but only 2 chapters have been concluded. So my message is, yes, it's good for states to be able to want to join, to indicate their willingness to join. And of course, it's very understandable why they want to join, but it is a long, slow, and often bumpy road to the point of becoming a member. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you again for a most illuminating and very clear presentation from which we've all learned. It seems that this is a test of endurance that could go on for a long time. Thank you, Catherine. So we move immediately, though, to Milada, who will talk about integration and conditionality. Milada?
Thank you so much, and thank you to all the organizer. It's really a pleasure to be here. I think I'll start by saying more broadly, I see this as a moment, a kind of a wake-up call for Europe. Many things are being redefined. The transformation potentially for contestation in Europe and European integration is really significant. And there might be positive things, such as the revival of EU enlargement, which has been completely moribund for the last several years. But as we think about some of the potential positive impacts for European integration and contestation, it's just important to pause and think at what tremendous human suffering is being born to create this kind of watershed moment. People talk about, Ukrainians talk about how Ukraine is fighting for Europe, and there are a couple of questions that are really at the foreground today when we think about EU enlargement. What does it mean to be European? Is liberal democracy going to be an anchor of European integration, or are we going to allow the European Union to be decoupled from the regime type of liberal democracy? Giving candidate status to Ukraine, it's interesting because as Professor Barnard showed, there's this long history of countries being candidates for a very long time. But it's clear that candidate status at this moment has tremendous political and geopolitical significance. And the significance is also about a sense of fairness. When I speak to Ukrainians and others who are following this process, candidate status for Ukraine is about kind of indicating which way the European integration process is going to go, and a kind of somewhat symbolic step, but a one that shows, that signifies a sense of fairness for many Ukrainians. Now, how can this EU enlargement process be revived? I think at the heart of it what's really essential is that the EU enlargement process comes back to being based on meritocracy. Now, it will never be a perfect meritocracy, but there has to be some correspondence between countries making efforts to satisfy the requirements of EU membership, whether they're the broad ones specified in the Copenhagen Criteria, and then sort of given life through the Commission and the regular reports, or the very more technical acquis related to the internal market. But of course, it's that first basket of acquis that we're worried about in terms of EU enlargement. It's rule of law, it's the robustness of liberal democratic institutions, and not so much the internal market aspect of it. What we see from the earlier enlargements is that when you have political will for EU enlargement, meaning the member states are on board, they've resigned themselves, or they're excited about one or the other, that the EU, these countries do have the prospect of joining. And then within that, they delegate to the Commission and create a process that is perceived, always imperfect, but perceived as being based on meritocracy. Now, what we've had in the Western Balkans over the last few years is a case where a country like North Macedonia can work incredibly hard, can change its name, and still finds itself stuck in the process because there just isn't the political will to move it forward. So there has to be variation. Every country has to be evaluated on its merits. And I think in this case, if we are able to return to this, Ukraine has the potential to do very well. I think Maria Popova has worked on this, and we'll talk about it, but the sense that there is high state capacity, that the state administration at the local and national level can implement the acquis, but most critically that there's this bottom-up pressure for reform. So if we think back at the enlargement process and think of cases where we can really think that this process was a win-win and moved the cause of robust liberal democracy forward. Slovakia is a nice example, right? You have the watershed elections in 1998, and then you have the EU enlargement process as a kind of guardrail or a kind of focal point for cooperation. You have broad agreement among political parties and civil society actors, but you also have that pressure from civil society groups, which is abiding in Slovakia in terms of accountability and transparency vis-a-vis their own government. My worry is France and Germany. It's hard to imagine this possibly working without France and Germany on board. And wake-up calls are difficult, and maybe Tim will talk about this, but what's happening in Germany today makes you worry, right? The hypocrisy is terrible to, a country that needs to admit that Russian gas and oil was pumping corruption directly into its centrist SPD and CDU parties is now, kind of slow walking this process. My final point is about Viktor Orban and the decoupling of the European Union integration process from liberal democracy. Sophie Monnet and I have written about this. It's incredibly dangerous for the EU and the EU enlargement process, because the heart of EU enlargement conditionality, the best tools are tools that help countries build liberal democracy, free media, robust civil society, bringing stakeholders to the table, transparency, decentralization. And, if you have one or more, along with Poland, countries that are not liberal democracies and are actually trying to export illiberal democracy, then that fundamental dynamic in the enlargement process is really under threat. And finally, I've realized this in the last few months, how much Orban has damaged the reputation of all of Eastern Europe. All post-communist EU member states. I was recently at a conference of mainly West Europeanists, and I was shocked at how West European it was. All Eastern Europe was orientalized in a way that reminds me of the 1990s. In fact, somebody literally asked me, but aren't all post-communist countries just run by little Orbans? And so this is dangerous, and something that really needs to be pushed back against, because there's tremendous variation, of course, in post-communist Europe, and huge problems with little Orbans in Western Europe and the US as well. So I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Milada. Well, we've had 3 presentations there. Now, what I'd like now is for the 3 presenters to begin some questions of each other or some observations of each other. So who would like to begin? Well, why don't we go back to Roman? Would you like to take up any 1 or 2 of the points that have been raised?
Well, it's thank you for all the comments and the interventions. I just would like to discuss and direct my question to Milada about the issue what she just discussed regarding Hungary. So here in Ukraine, Hungary is seen like quite an obstacle towards the Ukraine accession and further negotiations. And there is a existing fear that Hungary is going to use many political, economic, and possibly legal leverages to obstruct Ukraine's success on the road of accession. I just want to ask you what she thinks, how far Hungary may go, and whether the EU solidarity finally could prevail over this Hungarian policy. Thank you.
Milada, would you like to concise?
That's an excellent question. I feel like, you know, France and Germany are a bigger concern to me, in the sense that, you know, Viktor Orban is willing to do a lot to keep Moscow in his corner, but he also wants to keep EU funds and so forth. So the big countries do have leverage over him. What I'm more concerned about is Poland, actually. You know, the peace government is not much better than the Orban government in terms of destroying liberal democracy at home. And yet it's this great friend to Ukraine. And hopefully it can redefine itself on the European stage, and the peace government will embrace its European position and move away from the terrible things it's doing at home, including vilifying LGBTQ and other minorities that it shows as culturally harmful, that it depicts as culturally harmful. I don't think Ukraine wants to join the EU that the peace government would like to have, in terms of this kind of vilification of culturally harmful, of groups that they portray as culturally harmful, for example. Okay. So that's a dilemma, right there.
Thank you very much. Catherine, did you want to comment on this point? Catherine, is Catherine there?
I believe Catherine already had to leave, unfortunately.
Oh, I see. All right. Okay. That's fine. That's fine.
Dennis, may I ask one more question, if possible, just to follow up, if possible? Right. Yeah.
Question from you,
yeah. It's unfortunate that Catherine has left, but I hope my colleagues would help me. There is another issue which is on a top of agenda in Ukraine. I'm sorry for raising focusing on Ukraine right now, but this issue is the ever-growing competing role of the British government in the time of the accession. There is an impression, though it could be false, that Premier Johnson is sort of playing a competing game, trying by offering different semi-integration projects, mainly in field of security and defense, to Ukraine. Or just what's your feeling? Is it a true competing game with the EU, or just a tool for internal political survival? Thank you very much.
Well, I'm not quite sure who's best qualified to answer that. I wonder if I can just go off piste for a moment and ask Timothy Garton whether he would quickly comment on that point.
Sure. There's an easy answer to that. The only strategy Boris Johnson has is the survival of Boris Johnson. There's absolutely no governmental foreign office strategy behind those proposals. Many of them, by the way, are genuine attempts to support the security and defense of Ukraine. I think much more serious as a danger is Emmanuel Macron's idea of a European political community, in which, as in François Mitterrand's confederation proposed 30 years ago, you would wait a very, very, very long time.
Thank you, Timothy. I wonder if I could, I think that's a perfectly beautiful, complete answer to the point. I wonder if I could raise a question with Roman and with Milada, since Catherine has gone. According to your own views, what are the main obstacles in Ukraine's candidacy? What are the main obstacles? Catherine mentioned how this process could go on for a long time, and she mentioned obstacles. What, in your opinion, perhaps we could start off with you, Roman.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's a rather difficult question because many factors come together. Just briefly, what Catherine just mentioned. Yes, there is Article 49. With several criteria. Criteria number 1, geographical, has been satisfied, and it was already satisfied several years ago when the association agreement entered into force, because there is a direct reference to Ukraine as a European country. It's fine. Next, there are Copenhagen criteria. We have already discussed them. It's not so easy to achieve, but Ukraine has been working for many years, at least to align. But what concerns me the most, that the same Article 49 mentions that the Council may sort of reconsider or broaden the accession criteria. And for example, the absorption capacity is one of them. So basically the key is always in the hand of the EU Council, and it gives a big power to the national governments, like what I mentioned, Hungary. And last but not least, the factor which unfortunately is not being mentioned, but very serious on the way of the Ukrainian accession, is the future Ukraine-Russia peace deal. It's, in my opinion, it would be very difficult to talk about the finalization of the accession before the peace deal is reached, for many reasons which could be discussed later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Roman. Milada, would you like to comment on this point of what do you see as the obstacles to membership, perhaps following up some of Roman's points?
Right. So I already mentioned France and Germany, but in terms of in Ukraine, my biggest concern, I think, is who has power after the war is over. And I don't mean necessarily at the national level, but at the regional and local level. If we look in the Western Balkan cases, Bosnia, Croatia as well, Serbia, you know, after war, especially with refugees and people leaving the country, the people who are left in power are in those cases were people who were very quick to use ethnopopulism and ethnic nationalism to appeal to voters, and who set up their own, you know, little post-war fueled corruption fiefdoms. You know, Bosnia, in terms of political change, is at a standstill for that reason. So I am optimistic about Ukraine in terms of that, but it is a worry. Who has power in different places in the war ends?
All right, just to wind up this brief discussion, Daniel, are you there? Would you like to comment on this point of the obstacles?
Thank you, Dennis. Yeah, excellent conversation. In fact, I'm reworking my presentation in real time here as I'm listening. I just want to address that last comment, and I think it's a very good one. Who will remain in power? I have no doubt that there will be attempts by some of the old oligarchic clans to reassert themselves. I also have no doubt that they will fail. That's at the central level. I think that what we have seen is that war is a great accelerator, and it accelerates trends that were already taking place. And I think one of those trends that were immensely popular and took hold very, very quickly, because they play to the inherent Ukrainian capacity to self-organize, is local self-government and regional development. And I think that you will see a much bigger strengthening at the local level. And I hope that any reconstruction that take place is not done in a Gosplan type of centralized manner, which seems to be happening right now, but that it is done with and in conjunction with the regional leaders. Ukrainians do not like centralized power. They will not allow anybody to take control of the reins of the country. And I think that this actually, in terms of EU notions of subsidiarity, can play very, very well into Ukraine's hands as part of its EU accession process.
Thank you, Daniel. That's a good point, I think, on which to end our first discussion. So now I'm going to move and hand over to Katerina, who will moderate the second discussion. Katerina, all yours.
Thank you very much, Dennis. I also apologize to those people who were raising some other questions. If we have sufficient time, we will return to them in the closing Q&A. So without further ado, I'm giving floor to Professor Timothy Garton Ash, and we are starting with some bigger geopolitical considerations.
Thank you. I have had no doubt that Ukraine wants to join the EU since I stood in the crowd on the Maidan during the Orange Revolution in December 2004, and have never seen such a sea of European flags before or since. A colleague of mine, Marnie Howlett at Oxford, just did some polling with the Democracy Initiatives Foundation in Kyiv. Obviously only in Western and Central Ukraine was possible. 89% support for EU membership, 89%. The question is, does the EU want Ukraine to join it? And there, my argument is that it should, but I'm not sure if it will. It should, because the enlargement has been the great strategic success story of the entire European project from the early 1970s through to the early 2000s, all the way from the first enlargement, Britain, Ireland, and Denmark, through Southern Europe, Scandinavia, Central and Eastern Europe. But then, as Milada said, in the first decade of the 21st century, it ground to a halt. And the absurd position of North Macedonia, waiting 17 years, illustrates that. And the question is, can we restart that dynamic by persuading people in the EU that it's in the EU's own long-term strategic interest to do that? And that is the argument I would make on three grounds that we should, and that this is actually a strategic opportunity, not just a strategic challenge for the EU. Number one, what Milada alluded to, liberal democracy, values of Article 2. This war is about the defense of liberal democracy. That liberal democracy would be secured by enlargement to Ukraine. And by the way, when I talk about Ukraine, this means a whole geostrategic commitment for the next 10 to 20 years, because you cannot leave the Western Balkans at the back of the queue for another 15 years while you take in Ukraine. It obviously means Moldova, it means Georgia, and in time it means Belarus. So it's a big geostrategic commitment. So argument number one is values in liberal democracy. Argument number two, possibly the most important from the point of view of the EU, is geostrategic. That such an enlargement would be a major enhancement of European power, which is what we mean by European sovereignty, is European power. Between a rising China and a declining United States, we need as much European power as we can get. And having the breadbasket of Europe, the second largest country in Europe, a country which is in a crucial geostrategic position, together with the Western Balkans and Moldova and Georgia and so on, is an enormous strategic gain. Also because it puts Russia longer term into the position of no longer being an empire, but at least long-term potentially being a nation state. The third argument is about the actual strength of the EU. Anyone hearing someone speaking in a British accent and advocating EU enlargement might think you want to weaken the EU. Well, that was Margaret Thatcher's view. In my view, it's the precise opposite. It is precisely a further widening that requires further deepening, so that the great mistake in the big eastward enlargement was not the enlargement and the accession conditionality, It was the lack of post-accession conditionality, which is what gives us Viktor Orban, who has destroyed democracy in Hungary. I was there for the last election, which wasn't a fair election, and also is now in a position almost to veto or hold the rest of the EU to ransom on sanctions against Putin's Russia. So that if we made a strategic commitment to another big enlargement, that would absolutely demand further deepening QMV on foreign policy and issues like sanctions, getting more serious about rule of law and democracy, so that actually this would be a contribution not only geostrategically, but also to the deepening of the EU. That's what we should do. Will we do it? I'm extremely worried, extremely worried. I see all over Western and Southern Europe, including France and Germany, but also Spain, Italy, Portugal, extreme reluctance. What I hear recently from the European Commission is that at the moment they're talking about so-called potential candidate status, which Catherine didn't mention, which is a pis-aller that was given to Bosnia and Kosovo, and look how far they've got. So strategically, I think we should go for it. I'll be arguing for it, but I'm very concerned at where the discussion is at the moment and what will happen at the European Council next month.
Katerina?
Thank you very much, Timothy. So definitely ideas worth considering. And now I give floor to Maria Popova to continue with her presentation.
Hello, everyone. It turns out that Timothy and I have very similar ideas and very similar hopes and concerns. So I think my points will dovetail nicely here. I wanted to start with talking about the future by reminding something from the past. And in 1990, Italian singer Toto Cutugno won Eurovision with a ballad devoted to the about to be created European Union. He was backed up by a Slovenian group and he sang Insieme United Unite Europe. Now, this was the height of European unity and enthusiasm in the early 90s. You know, the Soviet subordinated communist regimes in Eastern Europe had just fallen, and Eastern and Western Europe celebrated this newly founded chance for unity. The EU has never really, again, achieved this level of enthusiasm. But what I would argue is that a start to Ukraine's accession now would provide an opportunity to recreate such a moment of unity and solidarity, but it's a window of opportunity that may close very soon. Here's why I think it may close. I mean, for all the talk of European unity in the wake of Russia's aggression in Ukraine, in fact, I would argue EU member states are not on the same page about how the war should end and what should come after it. Basically, on the one hand, we have the Baltics, most of the Central European, the Nordic countries that are committed to helping Ukraine win and quickly integrate into the EU. They believe in isolating aggressive Russia in the longer term, not just defeating it in this war, but isolating it in the longer term. And I would call this sort of the bold vision. On the other hand, as we've already mentioned, we have France and Germany, and I would also put Italy there, who don't really see Ukrainian victory as feasible. They want to help Russia save face. They think Ukraine's integration into the EU will take decades, as Macron has said several times. They want to re-engage with Russia after the war. So I'll call this the cautious vision. And clearly, the bold vision is in the best interest of Ukraine, but which vision is more conducive to European unity and coherence? Which vision is in the interest of the EU? And I would argue that the bold vision is better for the EU as well. The bold vision is really based on the realization that the war in Ukraine represents a clash between European values of freedom, democracy, and the rule of law versus the Russian world values that emphasize authoritarianism, cultural conservatism, the state over individual rights. So if the bold vision were adopted throughout the EU, I think majorities of citizens in all of the member states will rally behind Europe, both for geopolitical reasons and for value-based reasons. So the effect of this geopolitical tightening will be to invigorate commitment to European values, which is a much needed antidote to populism and Euroscepticism. So in the countries with rule of law and democratic backsliding issues, I think if majorities rally behind the EU predominantly for geopolitical reasons, because they're afraid of Russia, they will be also more likely to weaken, to abandon political agendas that are based on populism, to pressure the government to stop undermining the rule of law. So the result, I think, and this is probably more relevant to Poland than to Hungary, but I think it is given Poland's geopolitical clear alignment, sort of coupling the geopolitical alignment with the values-based argument creates an opportunity for Polish society to start pressuring the government to abandon attacks on democracy and the rule of law. So I think adopting this bold vision EU-wide will result in centripetal forces in the EU, more unity, stronger commitment to Europe, and closer integration because of this crisis. The cautious vision, on the other hand, will undermine European unity not only now, but in the longer run. France and Germany right now are focusing on the risks of escalation that come with helping Ukraine to victory. But what they really ignore here is the significant risk to European unity that comes from tacitly allowing Russia to subordinate Ukraine by not helping. You know, Ukraine's fierce resistance is based on Europe-oriented nationalism. If Ukraine loses due, in large part to the EU's insufficient help, to the EU tiptoeing to Russia, we really should start expecting nationalism and Euroscepticism to rise in the bold vision member states. These states' publics will be thoroughly disappointed in the EU's historical role in this war. They will also worry that as Russia's next targets of aggression, potentially, they could not expect solid support from the EU, and they would have to rely on their own nation's strength. I mean, this is a recipe for nationalism in those states. So the result will be more centrifugal forces in the EU, more division, more nationalism, and a deeper crisis. So I think that's why it is essential that the EU now embrace the bold vision over the cautious vision of how to proceed with helping Ukraine win this war. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. And before joining opening the discussion, I have the pleasure of giving the word to Daniel Bilak, who will speak about the more strategic and security-oriented challenges we are facing with the integration project.
Thanks very much. As the only non-professor on this panel, I'm significantly intimidated that I will be forced to give you impressionistic views as opposed to anything erudite like what we've heard to this point in time. Excellent comments by all of the panelists, and I think it sort of points to the fact that we are really entering. There's this tension between what has gone on before, pre-war, and what is going to happen, how the world is changing now post-war. We're now entering a new global order, a post-Bretton Woods type of a format where we just don't know where it's all going to happen and where it's all going to end up. And this is a particular challenge for the EU because the EU was founded based on a certain set of circumstances post-World War II. And we are essentially fighting the same kind of war that was fought there. And the repercussions we see are absolutely global. There are 400 million people that rely on Ukrainian grain that are not getting it. And somehow this is Ukraine's fault. This is the narrative that starts to come out into the press. And so the role of Ukraine in this new global order, especially vis-a-vis the future of the EU, and there were some excellent comments about the tensions in the EU, is absolutely crucial. And Ukraine, without a doubt in my mind, has become key to European stability and security going forward. So what we've seen essentially is, I mean, I'm just going to call a spade here because I don't have tenure anywhere and I'm not looking for it, so I can say what I want. But we've seen the cost of doing business with autocrats. Essentially, the EU has been on the take for at least the last 8 years. Ukraine has been at war with Russia since 2014. And we've been jumping up and down and screaming that, guys, we are fighting for your liberties. We are fighting for your values. We are defending the eastern flank of NATO and the EU. And everybody, especially, the Germans, well, this is, we really need to stop using our nuclear power so that we can get on the gas drip line, like a drug addict doing a deal with its dealer to the Russians and create Nord Stream 2. Purely a commercial project, as we all know, and as they talked about for the entire duration. The thing is that the concept, and they're very open about it, the Russians are open about everything. We just don't want to hear what they have to say because it doesn't fit conveniently into whatever deals are being done or perceptions that are there. The Russians were very open about the fact that they have this doctrine of strategic deterrence, which means you weaponize everything. You weaponize commerce, you weaponize culture, you weaponize politics, and weaponize energy, and now they're weaponizing food. And there's this tension that was commented on in the past about the decoupling. I think it was Professor Barnard was saying about the decoupling of liberal democratic values. There's a huge now tension between, in my view, between what happens when values and interests start to become disaligned, and the absolute weaponization of those values, which is what's happened with Hungary. And Orban is proud of it. He actually just won an election over this, the fact that he stands up to the EU, but he's happy to take all of the cohesion funding at the same time, which for some reason he gets. And at the same time, you allow the Russian Federation to infect the EU by sloshing money around, undermining democracy, et cetera, et cetera. Turns out everybody was on the take. And now people, they're still on the take. The European Union is funding the Russian war machine to the tune of 1.5 billion euros a day by paying for its gas and oil. Whereas to this point in time, Ukraine has probably had 2 billion euros of assistance for the entire duration of the war. This is financing of a terrorist state. Russian Federation is a terrorist state. So I wouldn't call the cautious vision, I would call it the appeasement vision, that this is business as usual vision. And that is the big tension. Ukrainians have reminded the EU, to probably the discomfort of most of the politicians and business leaders, what the core values of the EU really are. And by the way, they're worth fighting for and dying for. In fact, Ukrainians have fought for and died for those values twice now, and have been dying since in 2014. They've been dying and fighting for them this whole 8 years. The sanctity of life, the dignity of the individual, freedom of choice, freedom in general, and the rule of law. And I think this comes down to my last point, which is, the EU has lost its way to a large extent, and Ukraine is helping a lot of people. What's happening in Ukraine has helped a lot of people. It resonates with them what these values stand for, especially the public, especially the parliaments. And this is where I think the key focus needs to be going on down the road, to get Ukraine into candidate status. There's no way we're going to stand for a potential candidate status or anything else and all of this bureaucratic mumbo jumbo. The moral argument is very, very clear. And Ukraine is not going to stand for a halfway house. And both President Zelensky and the foreign minister and the defense minister have been very, very clear on this. But the point is that the EU needs Ukraine just as much as Ukraine needs the EU. And I think that point was made by Professor Garton Ash. And the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement has already been a jumpstart. It's already been a pre-accession treaty. It was negotiated over years and years and years. It has almost everything the acquis communautaire has as a requirement in terms of closing those chapters. And it's been a huge success in anchoring Ukraine into the political and economic landscape in Europe. It's been the core of the reforms that took place since 2014, something we never really got credit for. We never got credit to the fact that our judicial reform of the Supreme Court makes what's going on in Hungary and Poland look facile, to be honest with you. And it's been a huge success, and it's had an impact on how rule of law is looked at throughout the country. There are controls now on how government decision making at all levels is taking place. And so, you know,
sorry to interrupt, but we're just running a bit tight on time. So can you
all right.
Gradually.
My last point is this: that it comes down to the political will. What is the political will of member states? This is Professor Garton Ash's point. All I've heard during this entire period of 3 months is 1,000 reasons why something can't happen. It's time for the pressure to come on for what can happen and happen now, and that should start with candidate member status. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Daniel. Quite a passionate way how to finish the session and open up the discussion. Perhaps because this was raised also in some of the questions, and Catherine Barnard pointed it out in her presentation. So it's quite clear that there are really not legal constraints why the Ukraine should not actually become a member country or reach the candidate status in an expedited procedure. The majority of the constraints we see and we heard from EU institutions are the political ones. So it's really come back to what all of you mentioned, the recalibration of the narrative of European integration, what really are the values we want to protect. But first, I would like to invite the speakers and panelists, if you would like to take on board some of the questions and things we heard in these past three presentations.
Maria.
Sure. I want to emphasize Dan Bilak's point that Ukraine cannot be offered a halfway house with potential membership or Macron's suggestions for watered down memberships, another concentric circle. This will be simply not only humongously disappointing to Ukraine, but I think it would be hurtful to the EU in the longer term, especially Macron's suggestion for the European community architecture is basically watering down EU membership, creating tiers of EU membership. It just breaks up the entire idea that you either belong to the EU or you don't. You don't want to water down membership.
Thank you, Maria. Timothy, did you want to continue on this point?
Yes. If we get to the question of the politics of the next month, the swing state is Germany. It's absolutely crystal clear. France is never going to be enthusiastic, nor is Spain, about candidate status for Ukraine. But if Germany followed the strategic logic of its own interests in Central and Eastern Europe, and after all, Germany is a very important country in the history of Ukraine and of the whole region, then it would. And that comes down essentially to an argument inside the governing coalition between the Greens, who absolutely see this. I saw Annalena Baerbock in Aachen the other day. She absolutely sees it. Robert Habeck sees it. The Free Democrats, who to a significant degree see it, and Olaf Scholz, who doesn't yet. So it really fundamentally comes down to whether the strategic argument can be got home to Olaf Scholz in the next month. That's what it comes down to. And I have to say, in all honesty, having followed it quite closely, that I'm not terribly optimistic, because, you know, most of what Scholz has said on this has been, I mean, I know for a fact that before the 24th of February, he was opposed to further enlargement. He's actually been quite positive about the Western Balkans, but opposed to further enlargement beyond that. So it would have to be a significant change of his position. And that's really what it comes down to, I think.
Thank you, Timothy. If we moved further away from the considerations of what member countries might be and for what reasons against the potential membership, let's imagine now for a moment that the Commission will actually deliver a positive opinion and the Ukraine will reach the candidacy status. That's one of the questions that was raised also in our Q&A session. So what's next? What are the challenges the EU will be facing once it decides to actually integrate Ukraine?
Could I ask a question?
Of course, go ahead.
It's, I guess, to Timothy, and I guess that Chancellor Scholz has been very busy trying to keep former Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder out of the sanctions list. So he's just focusing now on what has to be done with Ukraine. But I come back to this issue that you have this schizophrenia in the ruling coalition, but yet you seem to have some very robust positions coming out of the Bundestag, and you seem to have German media surprisingly taking a very robust position on this, and a lot of protests, demonstrations, etc. in the German public. Do you sense that there's a shift that's potentially taking place? I mean, this is an iterative process. I mean, we can talk about what can happen, what can't happen, but it's all based on what we understand from the past. Is this something that can be churned up?
So listen, there's an incredibly lively debate in German public opinion and media. The critique is not just from the right, it's also coming from the left liberals, from Die Zeit, which is the house organ of Ostpolitik. And the things that Germany is serious about is reducing energy dependence. I mean, I personally was in favor of an oil, gas, and coal embargo, a total embargo. Okay, that didn't happen. But Robert Habeck is really doing everything he possibly can to reduce that dependence as fast as possible. And I think the whole country is reorientating itself. That's enormous. That's hugely significant. The military Zeitenwende, we'll have to see what actually happens. At the moment, it's just a big word and a huge figure, 100 billion, but what the military reality is. The missing piece in that story is your geostrategy. And what you have to understand, Daniel, is Olaf Scholz is starting from zero, from a position where basically before he became Chancellor, he had no interest in this area and very little knowledge of it. You know, he knew everything about financial and economic policy. He was very big on EU deepening and integration, but he knew very little about this area. Unfortunately, he's got to learn fast because, as we've all been saying, the decision made by the European Council, you know, it's 4 weeks away, and that's when he's got to make the commitment.
Can I just jump in and ask you something, maybe to Tim? But in the medium to long term, isn't it in the economic interest of Germany in particular, but other EU countries as well, to have Ukraine as an EU member, both in terms of making a lot of money in terms of the reconstruction of Ukraine and just having such a big country in, and also the demographic crisis faced by the EU? Awkward to talk about, but Ukraine would help.
Absolutely. I mean, you're spot on. And in particular, the problem Germans are waking up to is that the country's current economic business model is incompatible with its values, because its business model consisted of buying cheap gas from one tyranny in Russia and selling cars to another tyranny in China. And people are beginning to wake up to the fact that that's a real tension. So the idea that you could have a large new market, a large area for investment, which would be geographically contiguous and a liberal democracy, should in principle be very attractive. But the Russian lobby in the German business world, the so-called Ostausschuss der deutschen Wirtschaft, is enormously strong. So it'll be a big reorientation. But absolutely, the argument is compelling.
I can tell you that 30% of every car made in Germany gets its parts from Ukraine.
Yeah, which is why they're having difficulty making cars in Germany. Yeah.
Please go ahead if there was an additional point.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say that unfortunately I have to leave in a few minutes. So if there was any other point specifically to me, I'd be happy to take it.
I would ask, sorry, follow-up question then, because Tim has to leave. I mean, it strikes me that as part of this new geopolitical alignment and Germany's place in the world and the EU's place in the world really depends. This isn't so much about Ukraine as what are going to be its relations with Russia later on, and what is Russia going to look like, and to what extent does the EU, coming to Maria's point, I think, do they want a complete victory? Because we can defeat the Russian army in Ukraine if the EU and the United States allow us to do that. And I don't know whether they're ready for the repercussions of that.
The answer is no, they're not. I mean, obviously, one then has to differentiate that, but broadly speaking, one hears more and more voices, Daniel, which are saying, oh, surely we must settle, we must get to a peace agreement and so on. So that I don't think there is a sort of settled commitment to doing what it takes, which means continuing to support Ukraine militarily until there's a clear Ukrainian victory and a Russian defeat. That's what it means. And then only do you actually have a negotiation. So I think one would have to be concerned about that. But the geostrategic argument is, you're absolutely right, much larger, because it's actually about Eurasia. It's actually about what Halford Mackinder called the heartland, because it's not just building out Europe to parts of Central and Eastern Europe. It's also about the position of Russia. Russia ceasing to be an empire and one day becoming a nation state, and a nation state which long-term sees its future with Europe rather than a junior partner of China. I mean, that is the great game for the next 20 years. But the problem is, and on this I'm afraid I have to finish, that Germany stopped thinking strategically 30 years ago, right? So Germany had a strategy, I wrote a book about it, it was called Ostpolitik. It was a revisionist strategy for changing the geopolitical map of Europe to achieve the national goal of German unity. Since then, it's been a satisfied power, a status quo power. And it's done very little strategic thinking for the last 30 years. And I think, there is an understanding in German political and public opinion that that's what it's need to do, but it's got a long way to go actually to think strategically. On that note, I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave you, but thanks for a great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Also, we're going to have to move on to our next phase. So, Katerina, have you got anything you want to conclude here? Otherwise, we'll go on to open questions. And
I think this is actually a good place to start with the open Q&A sessions.
Katerina, can I just jump in and say one small thing? I think this discussion is really important and worrying, because we see that what's in play is politics in Berlin and Paris, Rome, and what's not so much in play is how well does Ukraine rebuild, reform, how much does it actually meet the requirements of EU membership, right? And unfortunately, this is the experience of the Western Balkans. It's not about how well they implement the acquis and meet the requirements. It's about politics in the EU capitals.
Thank you very much, Milada. Well, we're going to have to move on now to our open discussion. We're running out of time. We've only got 15 minutes left. So could I now invite members of the audience to pose questions or raise comments? Anybody out there like to? I mean, we'll continue our discussion internally if we have no external proposals. I think I have one question here from, let me just get it up. It's a rather long question. Let me just, so from Luke's Hamrick, we have, I don't know whether this is a question or let me just read what part of what he says. What transition periods should or could be in place, bearing in mind EU's experience with the last 3 enlargement rounds? In other words, what should be EU and Ukraine afraid of after the accession? Well, that's okay. Who would like to, maybe we go to you, Maria. Would you like to comment on that?
Sure. What I'd like to say about this is that previous enlargements are not a perfect analogy to how Ukraine would accede to the EU. So I think we shouldn't really be using them for to come up with timelines, with expectations of how long it takes or what the problems will be, for several reasons. I mean, first, Ukraine, unlike previous enlargements, has already been working towards acceding for a very long time. It is not starting this from scratch. It's already achieved a lot of technical things through the association agreement. It has been working towards membership for a very long time. That's one point. The second point is sometimes when we see people cautioning that, you know, it took Croatia this long, it's taken Turkey that long. Well, there are problems in those countries that prevented moving things along. They're not at all analogous to what we observe in Ukraine. You know, Turkey's democracy has not been working well, to put it mildly. So that's clearly what's stopping Turkey. And Croatia had to deliver people to the International Crimes Tribunal. This is not an issue that Ukraine would be facing. So I think what we have to do when we have these discussions is focus on what Ukraine specifically has done and what remains to be done for Ukraine, and not to prejudge the process with some lengthy timelines that come from previous cases.
Thank you, Maria. I wonder if I could just follow that up. So looking at Ukraine, Maria, would you say that as of now, Ukraine satisfies the conditions for membership? I know that's a rather loaded question, but what is your view?
I think Ukraine has gone very far towards satisfying all the Copenhagen criteria. I mean, it has implemented far more institutional reforms to its judiciary, to anti-corruption institutions than some of the current EU members have. So I think it has gone very far with the institutional reforms. What remains to be seen is how these institutions function in a post-war political environment. And if the signs in the post-war environment are pointing in the right direction, I think Ukraine can accede quicker than previous candidates.
Thank you very much. I have one more question here. Well, sorry, again to you, Maria. You're very popular. What in your view is it going to take to persuade the countries that have the cautious vision? A quick answer.
Well, that's hard. As Tim mentioned before leaving, we should probably leave hope of convincing Macron to change his position, and the key is to convince Germany. I think it's important to emphasize that we need to decouple also the cautiousness about escalation to nuclear war. That's one set of cautions, from cautiousness about whether we should think about Russia being too big to defeat. And I think that is the latter issue that needs a breakthrough in thinking, in imaginative thinking, and sort of think that there is no reason to go back to business as usual and engage with Russia. There are precedents when, obviously, during the Cold War, Russia was deterred rather than engaged with. And it is time to consider going back to simply containing and deterring Russia rather than seeking the first opportunity to re-engage. Let Russia change its regime first, and then we can talk about re-engagement.
Thank you, Maria. I don't have any more questions from the audience, so maybe we could, in the few minutes we have left, we can go back to our panel members, because I'm sure there are many things that we have not yet touched on, many things that could still be said. So is anyone on the panel, would anyone on the panel like to raise another question or comment on some of the issues that have come out? Yeah. Yes. Who is that? Daniel, is it?
Yeah.
Yes, Daniel, go ahead.
I think that was a very good question, the last one. How do you bring the appeasers around? And I think that, having been a former investment advisor to the Prime Minister, you show them what the economic benefits are of having a normal EU compliant country of 44 million people on your doorstep. And frankly, that's what the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement showed. I mean, it's thousands of pages. It's already a pre-accession agreement. And, you know, we have gone a long way, as Maria said, in regulatory and convergence and compliance. And companies feel like they're in another EU state already. That's I think one of the arguments, is that this is a big market for you with ports that go to around the world, and, you know, there's a benefit to them.
Thank you, Daniel. Anyone else like to come in on that point? Okay, maybe I could just raise another point. Could we just look at Russia for a moment? I know this is problematical, but what would be the Russian attitude towards progress to EU membership of Ukraine? Again, maybe Daniel, you could just comment briefly on this. I think I know what your answer will be, but you could comment, and then we'll get one or two other comments.
Yeah, frankly, I don't care.
Okay.
I mean, I think people need to understand one thing: that Ukrainians are going to fight to the end, whether we get the weapons or not, and that there is not going to be any peace in Europe and stability in Europe until Russia is defeated. And, you know, I think asking Russia for what it thinks about Ukraine at this point on any issue is really irrelevant, and it's detrimental to European security.
Dan, could I just follow up that? I understand absolutely your answer, but could I follow up? Is the Russian dimension a major factor in the deliberations of the EU? Maybe if you could briefly comment that, then I'll turn to one or two of the others.
Yeah, no, 100%. It's because the EU is used to seeing, comes the new geopolitical dimension. It's used to seeing the world through Russian eyes, and it's used to seeing Ukraine in particular and its own security and commercial interests through Russian eyes. And that's going to have to change. I mean, if Ukraine is able to defeat the Russian army in Ukraine, it could set off a huge set of chain reactions in Russia, just as Chernobyl did to bring down the Soviet Union, that, you know, a lot of people are terrified of, because they're not sure what the outcome is. Better a devil you know than one you don't. But I think that, you know, this comes to the point that Tim was making about having some confidence in yourselves as Europeans and as the European Union, that, you know, we are going to become stronger out of this and more secure down the road.
Thanks, Dan. Now, before I hand over to Katerina to bring the to summarize and make some final comments, I'd just like to invite members of the panel to make a final comment. And let's start off with you, Roman. You initiated all of this. Would you like to have a final comment?
Yes, thank you. Actually, I also wanted to sort of follow up comments of my colleagues, but to summarize, yes, the objective to join the EU is a great consolidating factor within the Ukrainian society and beyond. However, there are certain dangers which must be seriously considered. There is a discussion about the notion integration through war. So it means that the war is, and the objective of the integration is becoming part of the warfare internally. So it consolidates the society as well as gives additional power and stability to the political elites. However, we should ask how far this notion can go, whether it can be reflected in so-called fast-track procedure for the membership or justify it. It basically means that Ukraine can be admitted to become the member potentially without thorough compliance with the Copenhagen Criteria and beyond. Also, it must be taken seriously how this integration through war is being perceived by other candidate countries. There is already resilience within the Western Balkan region. They basically look and a little bit envy that, in their opinion, war justifies fast-track approach for Ukraine. And possibly it's a reason and justification for Macron's proposal to set up this European political community. So, to sum up, certainly their membership is a great consolidating factor, but bears quite a few political challenges for Ukraine and for the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roman. Milada, a quick final comment.
Thank you. Roman, I agree 100% about the question of the Western Balkans. And I think this idea of meritocracy is important, that the EU accession process comes back to a more or less meritocratic process where Ukraine can shine in terms of its actual reforms and implementation of the acquis. And so can, Montenegro, for example. Second, I think the challenge after accession is the question of veto. We see that with Hungary, right? That's the concern. It's not so much workers or farmers, it's you let more countries in and you can have another obstructive government like Orban's. And so for better, probably for worse, the challenge of accepting Ukraine's accession along with deepening the EU by eliminating the veto in many areas is going to be a huge challenge. And finally, Macron, I think this is just preposterous. I mean, France traditionally wants to use the European Union to amplify French power around the world. What better way to amplify French power than to embrace this geostrategic vision of enlargement? I mean, as far as I can tell, Macron is just undermining French power. So,
thanks, Mary.
Preposterous.
Thank you very much. Maria, final quick comment.
I actually wanted to take the opportunity to answer a good question that was in the Q&A that we didn't get to about how Ukraine would accede and integrate into the EU with the regional oligarchs that were in its past and were clearly problematic from a governance standpoint. And what I wanted to emphasize here is that the war has also, I think, to a large extent weakened them by empowering Zelensky politically within Ukraine, and also actually quite literally by destroying some of their assets in the East. So I think they will come out of this war weakened, and it gives an opportunity to build a state that is governed by the rule of law and does not go back to oligarchic power. So
thank you, Maria.
Let's not forget all the oligarchs we have in the West, from Jeff Bezos to Gerhard Schroeder.
Okay, Daniel, very quick final comment, and then
very quick. There was a question of what does victory look like to Ukrainians? 80% of Ukrainians say that victory is kicking the Russians out of every part of our country from that we got at independence. That includes the Donbass and Crimea. I could see, under the circumstances, with all the pressure we're under, that we would go a victory, a partial victory would be to start negotiating when we go back to the February 23rd contact lines. And then what would happen with Crimea and the rest of the Donbass would be a part of the discussions. But I don't see Putin settling for that. So I think where a victory is going to be destroying the Russian army.
Thank you, Dan. All right, well, thank you so much for all those comments. Now, Katerina has the unenviable task of bringing it all to a close with some very perceptive and deep reflections on what we've heard. Katerina.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, everybody. Not sure whether these will be deep reflections, but I do have some points and questions that should be pursued in future when thinking about the Ukrainians' integration. So what you all were mentioning is that we have now the time for recalibration of the European integration project, right? This is the time when we really should be thinking whether this is about the small technical aspects, the lengthy accession process we have observed in the last enlargement rounds, or whether this is about the essence of the integration. What is the purpose of having European Union and the integration process inside of Europe? It has been mentioned several times that the European Commission promised to have the accession on the merit. And some people keep wondering whether this means that Ukraine is not that much prepared to become a member country, but actually, and this was raised by many of our speakers, if you even look at VDEM data, Ukraine is doing much better than many of the member countries inside of the European Union in plenty of the chapters that will be part of the negotiation. It's also important to add that during the pre-accession period, Ukraine already fulfilled majority of what is expected from Ukraine to conclude in individual integration chapters. So I would say that even if we talk about the oligarchs, there are guilty countries inside of the EU member states right now, and Ukraine definitely is not less prepared than many of the EU member states. So we just see the repetition of the double standards inside of the European Union and towards the member countries. There were questions of what Orban is doing with the reputation of the Eastern Europe, but perhaps what is important to realize and what member countries and institutions should be also talking about, the opportunity to restructure European Union. Ukraine, if accepted, would be the 5th largest nation inside of the European Union. That would mean significant reshuffling of power. As we heard, probably not really pleasant image for France, but perhaps helpful image for other countries if we seek to diminish the power of some leaders, as is Orban or Kaczynski in the end in Poland. So it seems to me that it is important to keep raising this point and directing the discussion about the Ukrainian integration and just making sure that we are heard, that this is not really the merit-based discussion we hear from political leaders quite often, but the discussion about the values, what we want to have of European Union in future and how we want to proceed with our destiny as members of the European community.
Thank you very much, Katerina. A very fitting end to our discussion. So at this point, I'd like to thank all our participants for their important contributions. I'd like to thank Katerina in particular for so much of the organization behind the scenes, and not least for finding our participants today and recruiting them for the occasion. Thank you, Katerina. Thank you also to the organizers behind the scenes, very much appreciated. And so I think this is just really the beginning of the debate, and let it continue. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.